Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are jumping into a topic that is, it's absolutely central to the global Muslim experience. But at the same time, it remains one of the most consistently misunderstood religious norms, certainly in the Western world.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the prohibition against depicting the Prophet Muhammad visually.
Right, and it's such a critical boundary for billions of people. This is a non-negotiable spiritual and cultural line.
Yeah.
And outsiders often try to reduce it to this simple issue of like censorship or a free speech debate.
Right, that's all you hear about.
But the comprehensive analysis we've been looking at, it really shows that the roots of this they're deeply theological, historical, and even structural. It's about the very mechanics of how Islam defines monotheism.
So our mission today is really just one of understanding. We're not here to defend or condemn.
No, just to unpack it.
Exactly. We want to look at how this boundary was constructed and contrast the really strict consensus of classical pre-modern scholarship with the more diverse, context-aware views from scholars today. We really want to get to the bottom of it. How did a rule that isn't even explicitly in the Quran become such a fundamental pillar of Islamic identity and law?
Well, let's start right there, because that's often the most surprising point for people. There is no explicit verse in the Quran that bans images of the Prophet.
None at all.
Or even images of animate beings in general. It's just not there.
So if the ultimate divine text doesn't mandate it, where does this incredibly powerful prohibition get its authority?
It's derived primarily from the Hadith.
Okay.
So the authenticated records of the Prophet's sayings, his actions, his approvals.
Okay.
And classical jurists, especially within Sunni Islam, they treated the Hadith as this necessary secondary source. It was binding law that, explained the Quran's general principles in very practical terms.
Okay, so the logic kind of flows like this. The Quran bans shirk idolatry, associating partners with God. That's the core.
That's the absolute core, tawheed, pure monotheism.
And the Hadith, then, they supply the specific practical rules, the how-to make sure shirk just never happens.
You've got it.
Yeah.
The prohibition on all figurative art, and especially of the Prophet, is seen as a defense mechanism for tawhid. Because you have to remember, early Arabian society was highly polytheistic.
Full of idols.
Exactly. So using images of revered figures was seen as dangerously close to making them objects of worship. Avoiding his image was, for them, just practical protection for the faith's survival.
So at its root, it's about theological safety. And we see that modern conservatives still hold that line. They call it Islamic sensitivity.
They do.
But what about the reformists? How do they see it?
Well, many modern reformist thinkers, they accept the communal norm. They recognize its importance to identity.
Sure.
But because they note the lack of that explicit Quranic text, they often frame it as a historically rooted precautionary rule.
So not a divine command, but a kind of safety measure.
Precisely. They might argue that in modern, educated societies, the immediate risk of idolatry is a lot lower than it was in the 7th century. It suggests the rule could potentially be more flexible, but they still respect the communal boundary.
That distinction between divine certainty and precautionary law is so important. And it brings us to a key concept in Islamic law. Sad al-Darai.
Yeah.
That term is crucial, isn't it?
It is. It translates literally as blocking the means to sin. It's the precautionary principle in a nutshell.
So if an action, even one that's innocent in its intent, is likely to lead to sin down the road, it has to be banned.
And that's exactly the mechanism classical scholars use to prohibit even images that were intended to be deeply respectful.
But isn't that deeply distrustful of the believer's own intent? If your artist just wants to show veneration, why block that? Isn't intent everything in religion?
The classical jurists would argue that while the initial intent might be pure, you have to think about the long-term collective effect. The artist's intent today doesn't control how a mass audience is going to react to that image 50 or 100 years from now.
The famous slippery slope argument?
Precisely. They looked at the history of Christianity. They saw how icons, which were originally meant as aids to piety, often drifted into being revered objects themselves.
Right, leading to the big iconoclast controversies.
Exactly. Islam, they concluded, must preemptively remove any possibility of that drift. And beyond that, they also argue that any human attempt to capture the Prophet's supreme moral and spiritual lightness is just bound to be a presumptuous failure. It's inaccurate by definition.
So the very act of freezing him in a still image is a theological risk, no matter how respectful you are.
Absolutely. And think about the modern challenge of that. Conservatives argue that when you have images mass-produced, shared digitally, they freeze a single cultural stereotype of the prophet.
Okay, yeah.
And that one, potentially flawed, visual, could mislead millions of people globally about a man whose life should be understood through his ethical example, not, visual fixation.
This brings up a huge comparative call. I mean, Islam is uniquely strict on this. Why so much more rigorous than, say, Christianity or Hinduism, which are full of iconographic traditions?
The classical view explains it historically.
Yep.
Islam arrived in a very visual, polytheistic world. It saw itself as the ultimate correction.
The final word.
The final word, yeah. Establishing a purified model of worship that was free from the errors of earlier faiths that had, in their view, relied too heavily on visual aids, which always led back toward idol worship.
And contemporary scholars reframe this not just as history, but as a kind of cultural identity. They call it the aesthetic of transcendence.
It's a really beautiful way to put it. Islam is fundamentally text-centered, concept-centered. You can even say audio-centric. The word of God, the Quran, is paramount.
So by avoiding images.
By avoiding images, you redirect all that creative and devotional energy, and you see it flowering in these amazing abstract art forms, calligraphy, geometric patterns, architecture. It ensures that worship stays directed only toward the transcendent God.
That leads perfectly into this fascinating paradox. Muhammad is defined as al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human, but a man.
Just a man, not divine.
So if he's human, why is his image more guarded, more sacred than, say, a depiction of Jesus in historical Islam or any other historical figure?
The answer is so counterintuitive. Classical scholars argue that it's because he's the supreme human model that his image must be guarded so fiercely.
How does that work?
If you allow images, the focus shifts from his behavioral example, the sunnah, to a kind of personality cult excess, which could potentially lead to deification.
The very thing Tawhid is meant to prevent.
The very thing. So guarding the image actually protects his functional role as a human guide. It keeps the focus on his ethics, not his physical form.
And it seems modern sociological analysis confirms that. I mean, scholars note that an attack on his image isn't just a religious insult against one person.
No, not at all. It's felt as a direct attack on the collective dignity and identity of the entire global Muslim community, the Ummah.
So the image becomes symbolic of the whole community's self-respect.
Absolutely.
But this is where we hit a pretty significant historical wrinkle. If this ban was so strict, so universal, how do we explain all these beautiful Persian, Ottoman, and Mughal artworks that do depict the prophet?
And that's where the historical tension really comes to the surface. Art historians point to these miniature manuscripts, which were often for courtly, non-ritual use.
For private viewing.
Right. And they use them as proof that the prohibition just wasn't applied uniformly across all Islamic cultures, especially in the Persianate and Central Asian worlds.
But even in those artworks, the depiction often came with a kind of compromise, right? We're not talking about realistic portraits.
That is so crucial. To manage the theological discomfort, these depictions often had a compromise. Either the prophet's face was completely veiled,
Covered.
or it was left blank, replaced by a halo of light or fire. It emphasized sanctity and prophecy over just his physical features.
And how did the mainstream legal scholars at the time react to these kinds of compromises?
Well, the classical Sunni scholars, especially those in the Arab heartlands, they largely condemned them or just ignored them. They saw them as dangerous elite exceptions, as errors that were, stemming from Persianate cultural influence, and definitely not as normative religious art for the public.
So the historical evidence shows this tension. You have the strict Sunni legal norm on one side, and then the more visually expressive traditions on the other, often in Shia or Sufi-influenced areas, which saw respectful imagery as an aid to memory and piety.
Absolutely. The historical record shows the consensus was for avoidance, but the practice was always a bit more varied. And that's a tension scholars are still wrestling with.
Okay, let's follow that tension to what I think is one of the most brilliant distinctions in the source material. If a visual image is banned, why do such detailed textual descriptions of his physical appearance exist? You have this whole genre, the Hilya.
Right, the Hilya. These detailed verbal descriptions found in the Hadith, they aren't a contradiction. They are the intellectual replacement for the image.
Replacement.
Yes. Classical scholars argue that the verbal description engages the intellect and, most importantly, the imagination.
And why is engaging the imagination the critical difference here?
Because it lets the individual believer form a unique internal spiritual image of the prophet.
Ah, so it's personal.
It's personal. And that internal image, unlike a fixed external painting, actually aids in ethical emulation in following his character, the Sunnah. A verbal sketch lets you focus on the transcendent qualities that really matter.
So a drawing limits him. It turns him into one fixed, flawed object. But words allow him to remain a subject for spiritual idealization.
It's a mechanism that redirects all that creative devotion away from physical form and toward text and meaning.
It's the ultimate expression of that audiocentric nature of the civilization you mentioned.
It is. It's why calligraphy is so highly developed. It's the art of the word, which is the medium of God.
Okay, let's turn to the modern era, because this is where this theological boundary just collides with the global digital world. Does a 7th century rule against image-making Tazware apply to pixels, photography, film?
The conservative view is pretty clear. The principle is timeless.
The medium doesn't matter.
The medium doesn't matter. Avoidance of the prophet's image is the rule. And they often extend this to actors playing the prophet in a film, arguing that no human can possibly embody the al-insan al-kamil without being disrespectful.
But the technology itself introduces some fascinating new arguments, doesn't it?
It does. Some reformist jurists, for example, they note a distinction between a hand-drawn creation, which sort of mimics God's creation, and capturing a reflection, like photography.
Interesting.
So they might argue for reevaluating the ruling based on the purpose of the image. Is it mockery or is it education? They might allow a respectful, historically accurate depiction in an educational film.
But that's a risky line to walk.
It's very risky. The sheer global visibility of digital media means the risk of that image being repurposed for mass disrespect.
Yeah.
Well, it often pushes the consensus right back toward the strictest, safest prohibition.
And we have to address the elephant in the room now, the modern political climate. When an image is published that crosses this boundary, the reaction can be explosive. And our analysis makes it clear that the outrage over provocative images is rarely purely theological.
That's a key insight from modern analysts. When you see these large-scale, sometimes violent reactions, they're almost always a volatile blend of that deep religious devotion.
You're right.
With layers of post-colonial resentment, nationalism, and identity grievances.
So defending the prophet's image becomes a kind of proxy for defending Muslim sovereignty and collective dignity against perceived cultural aggression.
It's a political lightning rod. Precisely. And many intellectuals recognize that leaders or political groups can instrumentalize this genuine religious outrage.
How so?
They can use the defense of the prophet's honor to, divert attention from domestic problems, consolidate power, or rally nationalist sentiment. The outrage at the grassroots level is real believers are genuinely insulted, but the political machinery can use that sincere piety for its own ends.
And given that volatility, what's the mainstream scholarly response to violence? The sources are very clear that institutions just universally condemn vigilante actions, like the attacks after the Charlie Hebdo publications.
Oh, overwhelmingly condemned. Mainstream Islamic institutions like Al-Azhar, they stress that vigilante violence is absolutely contrary to core Islamic ethics.
They argue it betrays his example.
It tragically betrays the Prophet's own established model of patience, restraint, and mercy. The violent act, ironically, contradicts the very moral character they think they're defending.
Which leads to this final fascinating irony that modern Muslim thinkers point out, the Streisand effect. Doesn't all this intense focus on publicly policing these images actually just amplify the offensive material?
It absolutely does. And some modern Muslim intellectuals are now advocating for a strategy they call dignified silence.
Dignified silence.
Yeah. They argue that violent protests or huge public outrage only make the offensive material famous. It validates the attacker's goals.
So they advise what?
Quiet internal adherence, prioritizing intellectual defense, or just simply turning away from ignorance. They argue the true focus should shift from policing external images to actually cultivating the prophetic ethics within the community.
That feels like a really profound adaptation to the global digital age. So if we step back and summarize this entire deep dive, the prohibition is less about the technical act of drawing.
Much less.
And far more about establishing and defending a sacred boundary for theological survival.
That's the core takeaway. That sacred barrier does two essential things for the Ummah. First, it protects Tawhid by blocking that classical path to idolatry, keeping worship pure.
And
Second, in the modern era, it protects the collective identity and dignity of the community in a globalized, highly visual world that can often be disrespectful. The real tension for scholars today is how to uphold this protective principle forged in a homogeneous society in our incredibly pluralistic and contentious global reality.
And that leaves us with one final thought for you to chew on. We established that the ban on figurative depiction, it spurred this immense world-class creativity in non-figural arts, calligraphy, geometry, architecture. So if human creativity truly flourishes under specific self-imposed restrictions, what modern medium, born from this icon refusal ethos, one perhaps built on abstraction or text or sound, what might be the greatest unseen artistic or cultural contribution of Islam to the world today?
A fascinating challenge indeed. Thank you for joining us as we charted the theological map of this deep dive.
Until next time.